I know people right now are like, man, you're naming something like, yeah, I'm a Christian and I believe God is sovereign and there's this world but I'm really grieving this thing and I don't know what to do. Like, so what do you say as a pastor and preacher?
So good. So good. And it's, so the lament bit for me was really important. I mean, I've had to lament a lot just in my own personal fault lines and character issues, circumstances. And Walter Brueggemann has just helped a great deal in understanding what lament does is it names what's wrong in a covenantal context. And so what that means is I'm assuming the character of God when I'm naming what's wrong. So it's different than complaining, right? Complaining in impinging upon the character of God. God, you are an ass and you just did this and da 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 da. This is God, you're good. So why is this happening? Hey, God, you're so freaking faithful. Why would you let this, right? So there's a really, I don't know how subtle the difference is, but for me, it was really empowering to be able to pick up the Psalms and go, oh, okay, why have you forgotten me? Where are you? Now, everybody will say, yeah, of course, we have permission to do that. Nobody I know prays like this. Nobody. Our prayers don't sound anything like the prayers in the Old Testament with people who are lamenting. Our prayers are, we're convinced that prayer is a place to be good, not a place to be honest. And so lament carves out that space where within the context of who God is, from within the faith and within the covenant, we go before God and name what's wrong, right? Lament, for it to truly be lament, has to tell the truth.
Wow.
You don't polish it, you don't clean it, you don't apologize or try to make God look good. Lament presupposes God's character, his righteousness, his goodness, and we go, what are you doing? How in the world? Why are you far off? And there's a deep theme in the Psalms where Brueggemann categorizes some Psalms as Psalms of orientation, meaning the world is good. God is perfect. Like the world is ordered. Creation is fantastic. I am flourishing. I'm oriented toward God and everything is good. Life is good. But the majority of Psalms, he says, fall into a category he calls disorientation. You know these categories, my friend. That where the bottom's dropped out and things have fallen apart, and I have no idea where God is or what he's doing. And that produces, if you're faithful in the midst of that part, that produces something he calls new orientation, which is it's those Psalms where the psalmist doesn't say like, hey, you're awesome and everything's great and I'll praise you forever. But the psalmist will say and said, hey, you rescued me from the pit. Like there's a limp now to the psalmist, and to the writings. And lamenting is walking with that limp. It's like, I did this thing with my kids and, we're all struggling to be, either teachers or spiritual leaders or just like normal adults.
A good dad. But a dad who doesn't lose his temper, right? Yeah, no, I got you.
Jeez, I know, it's so hard. But we talked about lament, and I had them write down on 5 different cards, like 5 things that they missed, that they were missing right now.
So good.
And man, they had those things. Like it was, then we went around and we shared them. And it was fascinating how close grief was on some of them. To watch our kids, the things they were deeply grieving. And then what we did is we just threw them in this little fire pit and said, well, we have nothing we can do about that.
Yeah.
There is nothing, right? That is totally outside of our control.
Yeah.
And how awful is that? How awful does that feel? That just feels awful. And then to say, okay, but we think that God still, God brings good out of evil.
Yeah.
And so what do you hope he brings? And we were trying to sit into this like weird place of grieving, but not as those who have no hope. We're still resurrection people, but
Yeah.
damn, Good Friday hurts.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that was meaningful for them, but it was meaningful for me, to be
Man,
able to name that and for my wife and I to talk about it.
I feel like that would be such a helpful practice for people to do, because you're also giving us language on how to lament, like some practicals. Like you're saying, lament is different than complaining. I think that's a really good nuance, or a little like side note. There's also that in order to lament, you have to be true and honest with where you are, and you have to know the real character of God. Like those almost like
Hmm.
that those are like, so there's some truth there. And then to actually name the experience, like I was driving with my boy Ezra,
Mm,
who's 6, and we drove somewhere, and he was just looking out the window,
mm,
and he just said, I wish the sickness would just go away. I'm like,
mm.
oh buddy, why? What are you feeling right now? And he just started crying. I miss my
Yeah.
friends. And it was
Oh,
like, and I just like, sat with it, talked to him about it. Yeah, it is sad. Like just helping him deal with those emotions. But how many of us aren't doing that?
right.
There's so many people that aren't like, I
Yeah.
just got to survive. Like, or even this other thing that's happening where like we haven't experienced the crisis of COVID in Southern California, like New York
Hmm.
or like other parts of the world.
Yeah.
And so what we do is we shame each other to not actually grieve
Totally.
right? So
Totally.
it's like, well, this is something that I learned, which was like,
Mm,
well, you can't complain in being broke when I was in college, being broke here, because people somewhere else are worse. And it's this like
yeah.
suffering, comparative suffering. It's just not a thing. So
No, it's not a thing. And the hardest part of being a part of a community who doesn't know how to grieve well is that. Not being given permission.
yeah,
Of course, we know it could be worse. Of course. Obviously, it can always be worse.
yeah,
But that doesn't mitigate the grieving of what the is. And all that shaming does is let you know that the person you're talking to doesn't know, has never grieved
yes,
or limped themselves,
yeah.
you know.
So good.
Yeah, so I think that has to happen individually, that has to
Mm.
happen at the family level. For ministry folks, I think we're foolish to not make space for that, and
Yeah,
that can be a simple question on social media, like, what are you missing? And I've just seen, lots of people willing to share that, or, hey, how are
right.
you? And particularly our single friends, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, to be home with a roommate, to be home
Mm.
by yourself. I mean, I just can't even imagine that. I
No,
jokingly complain about kids running around, but I'll take that over being alone.
yeah,
And so I don't know. I think there's something to that if the church began to embrace, and maybe that's something that God could bring out of this, is the church no longer operating from a place of happy-go-lucky, sort of cheerful, Jesus-y stuff, and operating from, no, this is really hard. And a
yes,
lot of the people who followed Jesus didn't get what they wanted and ended up really disappointed.
right. Well, and
You know?
and I think what you're describing is a church that expresses the full human emotion, the full spectrum of
Preach.
human emotion,
That's
and
right. That's
and I don't
right.
know if that has been a level of depth we're willing to go, because
Mm-mm.
so much of the church in the West has been built upon um, variety of things, programs, proficiency, best practices, and we're talking
Self-improvement.
self-improvement, and it's not a bad thing. Like, look, I get it, that's where it is, but God is doing something right now.